Welcome to part 3. You have stuck with me. I feel so honored. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you've had some fun concept takeaways from 1 and 2. And there's been something that I've mentioned that's given you a little bit of food for thought that makes you want to dig in and learn more. We should be inspired to learn more about this incredible body that we have. So it's tough to thoroughly cover topics in really short videos. Believe me when I say I could talk about this for hours, because I do, but I've been trying to at least open the door of awareness for some of these issues. So even if we don't have time to fully dive into them, I want you to at least have some more awareness. Now, speaking of diving in, let's go a little lower on our talk today. So the pelvic floor is an integral part of the pelvis and hip musculature. So sometimes people need Kegels, and they're an important part of the pelvic floor program. But before I hand out any pelvic floor contractions for homework, I like to make sure we aren't working against alignment. So a great example of this is the shoulder, because the pelvic floor is hard to see, right? So it's kind of hard to wrap our mind around sometimes pelvic floor muscle workings and alignment. But I want you to imagine that our pelvic floor muscles are our rotator cuff muscles. And the pelvis is the scapula, okay? So we're gonna take a trip up to another area of the body. So would it make any sense for us to do rotator cuff exercises if somebody has a winging, elevated, forward rounded shoulder, rib cage that doesn't move, scapula mechanics that are terrible, and we're gonna be like, oh, to help your shoulder feel better, I'm gonna give you some external rotation on top of a scapula that's not sitting well in a rib cage that's not moving well. And I mean, no, that would be stupid. If somebody went to physical therapy for that, they'd be like, fire that PT. That is awful. If you went into a gym and the trainer says, here, I'm going to give you some external rotation to help with your achy shoulder, they should leave. That is just terrible. That would be horrible programming. So that is going to irritate the rotator cuff further, probably cause more impingement. So likewise, I'm not a big fan of doing pelvic floor contractions without first working on pelvic alignment. So giving out Kegels without looking at alignment and integration of the rest of the body is a great way to end up with pelvic floor tension, irritation, and compensation. But just like rotator cuff work can be incredibly important for the shoulder, you're not going to say, oh, you're never going to work your rotator cuff. There's never a time when that's important. That would be stupid as well. So you see how we can go to so many extremes on social media. Oh, it drives me crazy. Anyway, so you can get pelvic floor contractions for the pelvic floor, and they can be really helpful, just like rotator cuff can be really helpful. But we want to talk about that pelvic alignment and hopefully keep it as simple as possible, because this can be a really fun topic, but it can turn really complex really quickly. So let's talk sagittal plane first. So is a specific tilt, pelvic tilt, our friend? Like, should we push somebody more to a posterior tilt and tucking under, or more of an anterior tilt? Well, let's just see what there is in research. So an increase in lumbar lordosis, which is usually accompanied with an anterior tilt, increases the risk of incontinence. There was another super old study that I didn't mention here, but it showed an increase of pelvic organ prolapse with a posterior pelvic tilt. So an anterior pelvic tilt greater than 7 degrees increase the risk of back pain and hip impingement. And hip impingement is another thing that likes to rear up its head during that late pregnancy and postpartum time period. So a posterior pelvic tilt had increased pain associated with a disc herniation or degeneration. All right, so assessing for pelvic tilt and pelvic response to exercise is a great starting point for an assessment. So not that I'm a big fan of neutral all the time, don't get me wrong. Remember, I do dynamic athletic sports where I am tucking, I am arching. I think we should be able to move our pelvis in all directions. But what I'm talking about is being able to utilize all angles, which is great. What we don't want to see is somebody who is stuck in that posterior pelvic tilt and can't move into the anterior tilt, or vice versa. So this affects their pelvic floor, not to mention their low back and their hips. So that slide that we just covered was talking about sagittal plane alignment, but what about rotational alignment? What happens to the abdominal wall and diastasis recti healing when, let's say, one side of the rib cage is flared, one side of the pelvis is rotated, and the other side is not, then it becomes a situation of trying to herd cats for muscle firing. So nothing wants to work together. And what do you think has to work together for connecting through that midline? So what happens to a pelvic floor response when we have one side of the pelvic floor, one side of the pelvis that is rotated forward, and we have one side of the pelvis that's rotated back? How do you think that changes those pelvic floor muscle contractions in the middle? All right, or when one side of the femur is shoved forward in the socket, and that's changing the dynamic nature of the hip rotator muscles, which then changes the nature of the pelvic floor. So keep in mind, what you do to the hips directly affects the pelvic floor. The levator ani muscles have attachments directly into the obturator internus muscles. So the obturator internus is a hip rotational muscle, but it can be the source of pelvic floor pain and tension. So you don't need to worry about understanding all of that right now. But if you've had obturator internus pain, then you know, okay, it is definitely some pain. But the point is that the human body is incredibly kinetic chain driven. So if one part is overactive or underactive due to alignment, that will affect other areas and drive compensations that are often accompanied with dysfunction or pain. And it is so incredibly common, but also can be relatively easy to fix. So how does pelvic positioning in pregnancy lead to glute adductor, deep hip rotator tension, gripping, and decreased hip strength? Because this is all too common of a complaint in pregnancy, because remember that pregnancy posture, we're going into that inlet external rotation. And when that happens, we get a spreading of the top of the pelvis. So this is why if somebody is like, I am the same weight postpartum, but I can't get my jeans buttoned, I don't understand. And my butt is even flatter. I've lost my glutes. It is because this posture spreads the top of the pelvis. So it's going to create a wider pelvic inlet. And when that happens, you often get a squishing and that kind of flat butt syndrome that happens. So this can be why you see those changes in the pelvis. So why they end up gripping those deep hip rotators. Okay. Because our time today is a little bit limited, I would like to quickly target one popular muscle group that attaches to the pelvis and help leave you with a deeper understanding of the why behind the issues we often see. Now, there are so many muscle groups and I have so much fun digging into all of them. But for today, I picked the adductors because I thought, that's going to be kind of fun. You thought I was going to say glutes, right? But I thought, adductors, let's twist it up a little bit. So I often see two different scenarios. So scenario one, they hold tension with trigger points. So they have this gripping adductor muscle. Or scenario two, they have very loose, inactive, I'm going to call them apathetic adductor muscles. So I like giving muscles personality sometimes, but we just need to make sure we update those labels as the muscles change and we don't demonize anything, because you know what? That TFL has a purpose and it can be really good, just like all the other muscles in our body. Okay, so we don't want to think, oh, this muscle gets demonized. As I see a lot of bad stuff of like anti-psoas or anti-hip flexors or whatever, but we need strong hip flexors. Anyway, another side note. So no one wants an apathetic adductor, and you really want to avoid one apathetic adductor and one adductor that's holding tension. Whew, that is not going to be a happy pelvis situation. So when we think about that, we think about our adductors, let's say we have one side that is really tight and pulling and one side that's loose. I mean, that is going to change and create a whole shifting and driving of our pelvis. Now, let's look at the adductor response on the pelvis and why adductors are so important for this postpartum time period. So the adductors attach to our femur. So they attach down our femur. So this is our femur, and they run to our pubic bone. So when we have, and the adductor magnus runs back toward this ischial tuberosity and actually can have a little bit of overlap with the hamstring, which is kind of fun. So when we look at adductors and we look at the effect of on the pelvis, our adductors run from our leg to our pelvis. And when they contract, they pull open on the bottom of the pelvis. So if somebody has femurs that are fixed in space, so my femurs are not going to move, and I squeeze my legs in, without letting my femurs move. I squeeze my legs in. That has a pulling open on the bottom of my pelvis. Go ahead and stand up with me and try it now. Place your feet like you're doing a nice little squat. Squeeze in together, getting those adductors to contract, and see if you can feel a pulling on your pubic bone. Okay, see if you can feel a pulling this open on the bottom. What you also may feel is a lifting, a natural lifting of the pelvic floor. So when the adductors engage, they naturally lift the pelvic floor. Now, the response when somebody can get stuck in this inlet external rotation state is the adductors. So as we open on the top, we come in on the bottom, the adductors get put in a little bit of a lengthened state. Now, muscles respond differently to that lengthened state. Sometimes they turn off and sometimes they hold tension. So muscles respond to a stretch in two different ways. One, they might shut off, and I see this frequently with people who do a lot of stretching for their hamstrings. Then they often lose that hamstring tension, and I say tension in a good way. They lose the hamstring stability at the pelvis, would probably be a better way for me to say that. When they lose this hamstring stability at the pelvis, they'll often compensate with deep hip rotator tension. So I've treated a lot of people that do a lot of yoga and have a lot of piriformis pain, and part of that is from excessive stretching and a muscle responding by shutting off. Or if we put length to a muscle, so remember, as we go into this pelvic positioning, we are lengthening those adductors. So as they lengthen, the adductor might be like, I've got to desperately hold on, and it might be trying to grip, trying to pull in. So muscles, like people, respond differently when stress is applied to them. So sometimes they freak out and sometimes they check out. So personally, I tend to be a little high strung, but my muscles completely apathetic, okay? So don't always coordinate with personality. So my muscles check out so fast. Anyway, it's nice to take a step back and have a little bit of a sense of humor when it comes to things like this, because we can feel like we're falling apart. I've met a lot of postpartum people that feel like everything is literally falling apart. But obviously, that's why we're there to help them. We want to help them move forward and we want to help them feel good. Let's talk a little bit about pelvis positioning and adductor response now. So the adductor fascia overlaps with the pelvic floor fascia, and the pelvic floor length and response changes with that pelvic alignment, okay? Just like those adductors change. So as the pelvis goes back to neutral from this inlet externally rotated state, as it goes back to neutral, this can help naturally lift the pelvic floor. And if we go into inlet internal rotation, then we can get a natural lifting and bringing up of the pelvic floor, which can create that natural pelvic floor contraction. Now, because the adductors have that overlapping fascia with the pelvic floor, if somebody is holding tension in their adductor muscles, then they can often be holding tension in the pelvic floor. So we get an overlap through pelvis alignment, we get an overlap through contracting, and we get an overlap through that tension or apathy with that natural pelvic floor response. So if the adductors are weak, then the pelvic floor might also try to compensate for them. So this can lead to pelvic floor tension. So strong adductors with good pelvic alignment help to decrease pelvic floor compensation. So it's one of the biggest things I'm going to look at when somebody has pelvic floor tension. SPD pain can also be a frequent outcome from adductor imbalance. So imagine one side of the adductors pulling into an anterior tilt and one side pulling into a little bit of a posterior tilt. Okay, now we get this side to side tension difference, but we also get that intra-adductor difference because the adductor group is made up of entirely separate muscles. So it's not like, oh, my adductor is firing. It's like, wait, back it up. Which adductor is firing? So now I want you to picture somebody's pectineus on one side is dominant for adductor pulling, but on the other side, they've got their adductor magnus, and they are both pulling out on the bottom of the pelvis, but one is pulling back and one is pulling forward, and ouch. I mean, that for the pubic symphysis is just going to be incredibly painful. And this is often accompanied by other muscle dominances and imbalances in the pelvis, and when cleared up, SPD pain SI joint pain, they tend to go away forever. Okay, so these are things we want to work on. So when might you want to integrate adductor work into somebody's programming? So as a rule of thumb, if someone has a lot of tension in their adductors, I'm gonna work glute medius first. Okay, I'm gonna get them with a really strong, active glute medius, because our glute medius, think about it as our opposition muscle to our adductor. If we get that glute medius working and firing, it's gonna help our adductor muscle calm down. We're gonna be able to decrease the overactivity of the adductor muscle. So if they don't have a lot of adductor pain and tension, then I may actually start integrating adductors first before doing glute medius or glute max work. So as a matter of fact, this person might have trigger points in their glute medius or be dealing with some deep hip rotator pain. So that's going to be the time when I'm going to want to start with adductor strengthening. So getting adductors helps the glute max work better because those adductors help facilitate a complete range of motion for the glutes by helping the femur and the pelvis find adduction and internal rotation, which is incredibly important for getting a great glute max. So think about that response to the pelvis, that kind of flat butt postpartum syndrome, and lack of adductors or too much adductor tension, and it all plays a role together. So it's kind of like this perfect little soup where you fix one and then it fixes something else, and all of a sudden people are bending over to unload the dishwasher and they're like, oh, I feel my glutes working. My glutes are back, without having to jump through all these hoops or do 1,000 bridges. When we change alignment, we change how muscles show up, because that muscle link tension relationship is incredibly important. I'm not sure if you've thought about adductors so much before, but I hope that was at least informative and interesting and fun. So I don't know about you, but I feel like I've barely scratched the surface and I just want to keep going. Do you have another couple hours to spend with me? I want to dive into every muscle group, every area of the body, look at how it influences tension, pain, and other issues. I also want to dive more specifically into diastasis recti and pelvic floor issues, along with pregnancy and postpartum specific recommendations. So if this mini course piqued your interest at all, and you're like me and you love learning, then I would be thrilled for you to join me in the big course, where I do literally talk about this for hours. Pregnancy Postpartum Corrective Exercise Specialist 3.0. It's a certification level course, and I guarantee that you will learn so much more about the why behind things, which will then also help with understanding, seeing it, and knowing what to do. But I also go through a lot of solutions as well. I don't want to make your brain hurt too much, okay? So we'll have so much fun learning together. So I want you to be sure to check out the course page. I'll link that for you below. You can get more information there, and feel free to email me if you have any questions about the course. So I'm looking forward to this continued learning process with you. And I just wanted to give you a huge thank you for joining me in this short mini course and sticking with me through all 3 of those videos. It was a pleasure, and I do hope that you took something away, or at least sparked some aha moments where you're like, I want to learn more about this. And it gave you some more interest and some more passion for helping people, because we need more people in this industry wanting to help.